What's going on, everybody? Welcome to episode number 40 of My Social Life. I'm your host, Jacob Kelly. Before we jump into today's conversation with Lee Dumas, there's a couple things that we need to go over first. Number one, let's address the elephant in the room. You're probably wondering, Jacob, why is this episode only like 10 minutes long? And well, let's get into that. Lee Dumas is a very busy person. If you don't know who John is the founder and host of Entrepreneurs on Fire, which is one of the world's most popular podcasts. He started it back in around 2012, 2013, and since then it has just skyrocketed. He's making millions of dollars a year because of his podcast. And when he started, he was posting daily episodes, a new episode every single day, and he did that for 2,000 days in a row. And you're probably wondering, how was he able to do that? We're gonna get into that in the podcast. But John to this day is still a very, very busy person. So what he does for interviews like the one here on My Social Life is he schedules 1 or 2 days a month from 12 p.m. to 4 p.m. to do all his interviews, and he batches them into 15-minute increments. So I only had John from 12 p.m. to 12:15, and he was on to the next interview. So I just took the opportunity to interview one of the world's most famous podcasters. Despite the fact that it was less than 15 minutes long, I wasn't going to turn this one down. And John provides a lot of value in the short amount of time we had him for. And on top of the limited window, when John and I were recording, he had a power outage at his home in Puerto Rico, and we lost probably 1 or 2 minutes here or there. He did extend the length of my total podcast. I think we ended up talking till about 12:20, so he was offline for 4 or 5 minutes, and then I got him after that for about another 10. So with everything, with some connection issues, the episode's just over 10 minutes long. But like I said, John provides value. And you'll notice that over the course of this short but very good podcast is that John is very good at getting directly to the point. He is concise, but he is to the point and provides value with everything that he says. And I really think you're going to enjoy this episode. And if you do enjoy this episode, please do me a favor and leave a rating and a review. It helps more people find the podcast, and it really helps to grow the community that we're developing here. And if you're one of those people that have recently found the podcast, welcome. I'm very excited to have you here. Make sure you subscribe, stay tuned for future episodes. And to everybody listening, make sure you screenshot this, post it to your Instagram story, tag at My Social Pod, and I will feature you on the account and send you a message as well. Now, without further ado, let's get to my conversation with Lee Dumas.
Yo!
How's it going, John?
You know, Puerto Rico's sun is shining, our birds are singing, life is good.
That's awesome. I'm happy to hear that. But I know we're limited for time, so I just want to jump right into it. Do you have any questions before we get going?
Zero.
Perfect. So I want to go back to the when you were posting daily. Can you walk me through that process? Because I post weekly right now, and I find that's a grind. So how are you able to maintain finding guests, editing, posting podcasts every single day?
It's because I batch like a baller. That's the phrase. That's the word. I would always do 16 interviews on the first Monday of every month, 16 interviews on the first Tuesday of every month. Those 2 days were my Super Bowl. I knew it was going to be long and exhausting and all that stuff, but I brought the energy, I brought the heat. And then guess what? I had 28, 29 days to recover. So you need to just say, what's going to work for me? Doing a weekly show like yourself, to me, that'd be 1 day per month. You're just doing 4 killer episodes. You're just getting up and you're saying, today I'm bringing the energy, I'm bringing the heat, I'm bringing the fire. After that 1 day, your month's worth of content is complete. You know, now you bring in a team like a virtual assistant or yourself when you're starting, whatever it might be, and you just start putting the systems in place, putting the automations in place.
Awesome. I was curious as to how long you were posting every single day before things really started to take off with your podcast.
I'd say it was about 7 months of daily posting. So about 200 episodes approximately before I really started seeing some serious traction. There's a number of reasons for that. Number one, I wasn't a good podcaster. I mean, I had never done it before, so I wasn't a good speaker, presenter, communicator, any of those things. I had to put in the reps. So by episode 100, I was a lot better than I was at 0. And by 200, I was a lot better than I was at 100. And that's continued to snowball to where I'm now at 2,230 episodes of my own show, not to mention 1,000 episodes on other people's shows. So I've put in those reps, and that's what helped me get to that momentum, that traction. Plus, this was 2012, 2013. Podcasting wasn't this massive thing at this time. So it was easier to kind of catch a foothold and really capture a bigger audience because there wasn't that many options out there. Now in 2019, man, if you're asking the same questions, if you're just doing the same thing, you don't have a unique special catch for your podcast, I mean, you're not going to get any traction because there's just a lot of noise out there. So people these days in podcasting, in my opinion, this is just content in general, you don't need to look for this broad, vague, massive audience because it's going to be very hard to acquire. You should be looking for that small, passionate niche, that micro niche that you can dominate, that you can enjoy and make your way there.
And you've recently, from what I've looked at, you're about 2 to 3 days between episodes now. When did you make that decision?
Episode 2000, I made the big announcement podcast for 2000 days.
All right. So I want to ask you about the concept of it being too late to start, because from my research, you went to college and then you joined the military and then you had a job and then you started the podcast. So I'm just curious to know your thoughts on the concept of people complaining that it's quote unquote too late to start.
Cry me a freaking river is my response to that. Listen, the best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago. The next best time is today. When I started, everybody was whining and moaning and complaining that it was too late to start back in 2012. In 2015, it was the same thing. In 2017, it was the same thing. Now it's 2019 and beyond. It's always going to be the same people whining and moaning and complaining. Those are just people that are just saying, hey, I'm going to be a failure, so I might as well just come up with all the excuses in the world about why I'm going to become a failure. So if you want to be in that camp, go for it, do it, make it happen. Alternatively, why don't you just say, I'm going to make this happen, go forward and conquer, and start planting that tree today, because who knows where you're going to be in 5, 10, 15 years from now. But if you whine, moan, complain, use excuses, you'll be nowhere.
And I mentioned that you were in the military. Is there any lessons that stick with you today from your time there? I've heard people describe you as having a militant work ethic, but is there anything else that sticks with you?
You know, I will say that really coming up with a plan of action, being a disciple to that plan of action, that's been critical for my success. Is like saying, you know what, I learned in the military that nothing gets done without a plan in place. Like you can say like, go do this, go do that. But if you don't have a plan, if you don't have the logistics lined up, if you don't have the systems and automations in place, you're not going to win on a consistent level. So have a plan, be a disciple to that plan of action. And a lot of people talk about being productive. Listen, they're productive producing the wrong things. So you can be busy all day long, but if you're producing the wrong things, the wrong content, then you're not going to get anywhere. You're going to be going a million miles an hour in the wrong direction. So being productive is producing the right things and having a plan of action to accomplish that.
Mm-hmm. And then in a similar question, but in the context of your podcast, is there any key lessons you've taken away over your thousands and thousands of episodes that you've done?
Consistency wins. If you're consistent with your message, with your brand, with your content, with your production, you're going to win. Period. End of story. If you are consistent, you will win. So make that happen. Now, what does win mean? Well, set the goals, those aspirations about what your version of winning means. And that's going to, be the goal that you're drawn towards, the magnet that you are, being pulled into, and like that North Star that you're following. But the reality is, if you are consistent, you're going to win. Every single person says, oh yeah, I started a podcast, but after 6 months, it kind of petered out. I get it. It's hard to be consistent. That's why most people lose. That's why most people fail. That's why most day after day, putting it in, getting better because they're putting in the reps. Those are the people that win.
Mm-hmm. And then speaking of guests, I know you've interviewed thousands of people, but is there anybody on your like dream guest list that you've yet to interview?
Nobody.
Nobody? No, you're content with everyone that you've interviewed thus far?
Yeah. Hey, it's meant to be. It's meant to be. If they come to me and I get to interview them, that'll be great. If not, I'm just going to keep interviewing great people.
That's awesome. And so how do you prepare for a podcast? And like, what's your process?
I don't prepare at all for a podcast. And that's my strategy is I literally 30 seconds before I'm calling that individual on Skype, I'm skimming over their 30-word bio. And that's typically the first time I've maybe even heard their name or know anything about them, because my goal is to go into these interviews as curious as my listeners are going to be. So I'm going to be asking the questions that they would ask. I don't want to have any preconceived notions or have the curse of knowledge, as I like to say. I don't want that. I don't want the curse of knowledge. I don't want to know things that my listeners may not know. And so then I miss asking those questions. So I love going in blind, having just this open curiosity for what they do, for what questions I just want to ask them, that come very naturally by having just very little to no preconceived knowledge about who my guest is.
That's interesting. I've never done that before. That might be a strategy that I'm going to have to try going forward, because I usually do a ton of research. But with the frame of this podcast, it's typically about social media. So I was curious how social media has affected your podcast, or it being a non-factor in the growth of your podcast.
It just helps amplify your message, because you can just kind of take little splices and little dices, put it on Instagram, put it on YouTube, put it on LinkedIn, put it on Facebook. And, people aren't going to necessarily consume the whole podcast episode there, because that's not the format for it. That's not the medium where people are consuming that content. However, they might be like, oh yeah, like I feel like I've heard of that podcast, or I've seen that person, or I'm about to take an hour drive. I'm going to remember to now listen to that episode as I drive. So it's just like a way to kind of like be everywhere, remind people that you have a voice, you have a message, you're sharing this, you're sharing that with people, and making sure that you're, really getting out there in the world.
Mm-hmm. And I know you originally started your podcast because you were listening to podcasts in the car and you ran out of them one day. Are there any podcasts that you're still currently listening to?
I listen to so many podcasts. I am such a podcast listener, because I go for 2 3-mile walks every single day. So on those walks, I'm listening to podcasts, I'm thinking, I'm enjoying nature, getting natural vitamin D. I'm doing all those things that people should be doing on a daily basis. I'm actually moving. That's why I live in Puerto Rico, so I can do it 365 and not just like 3 months per year like people who live up in Canada. So, that's just one of those things that I do, is I listen to podcasts. I love the medium from day one. I loved podcasting before I was a podcast host. I still love it to this day. I'm really into Wondery, which is a big network of different podcasts. They have like Business Wars, 1+1, Imagine Life. They do some really good work.
Mm-hmm. And so as someone, I would describe you as an expert in podcasting. Do you have any quick tips or advice for someone, not that's just beginning, because I feel like that's what everybody asks, but for someone kind of in my situation where they've been doing it for almost a year now, they've been consistent with it, growth isn't too much, but they're still driving. Like, do you have any advice for someone that's in a situation like that?
Yeah, growth isn't going to be too much because, and I'm not talking about you specifically because I haven't studied your podcast, but you're not, and this is the general response, you're not standing for something unique. You're not micro niching down. You're not planting your flag in a very unique, special area that people can rally behind. I mean, this podcast that I've just done with you is a podcast that I've done on 100 other different shows. So like, what's different about it? Like, not too much. So like, how can you make your show special, make your show unique? How can you really micro niche down into an area that you're really excited about, that you're really passionate about, that people are going to be like talking about because it's different, it's unique, and it resonates with them?
Mm-hmm. And now, how much time do we have left here?
1 minute.
1 minute. Okay. So the last question I always ask everybody is, what's one question that you want to know the answer to about anything?
I would like to know the answer to what's next. And I think that's a lot of people should really realize that when you think like, oh my God, I've missed this, or I've missed that, or I've missed that. Well, wake the flip up and keep your eyes open and your ears open, because something's always coming. Something's right around the corner, and you can be the person to jump on that next thing. Like, I just pulled up App Store, or whatever they call it, and the number one app was YOLO. I'm like, what is YOLO? I've never even heard of this app before, but it's the number one app in the world. You've got to keep your ears open. You've got to keep your eyes open, because you never know what's coming next. And you could be one of the leaders, if not the leader, in that next thing.
Awesome. The final thing here, I get every guest, if you have a phone accessible, to take a selfie with their phone screen when I hold up the My Social Life sign. If you could email it to me after the fact and I use it for promotion, that would be awesome.
Let's do it. 1, 2, 3. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I appreciate you taking the time out of your busy schedule to do this podcast.
Dunzo. Thanks, brother.
Thank you, man. Have a good one. And thank you so much for listening to this episode of My Social Life. Whether you've listened the entire way through or you've only listened to bits and pieces, I really appreciate you taking the time to check this out. Do me a favor, go and follow John on social media and subscribe to his podcast, Entrepreneurs on Fire. I highly recommend it. I personally listen to it all the time, and it's going to leave you inspired, motivated, and give you insight from some awesome entrepreneurs all over the world. And if you'd like to follow me, you can find me on Twitter and Instagram at the Jacob Kelly. My DMs are always open if you ever want to chat. And if you'd like to follow the podcast, you can find it on Instagram at My Social Pod. And if you search it up, My Social Life on YouTube will pop up, and there'll be videos from every single podcast, including the full podcast in video form if you're a watcher and not a listener. But thank you so much again for listening to this episode. We'll talk soon.